Welcome everyone to the second episode of a musician's podcast, and today I have an incredible guest here with me. His name's Philip Klein, and he worked on projects like The Mandalorian as an orchestrator, Wish Dragon as a composer, which is made by Netflix and Sony. He orchestrated for the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, as well as The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, A Quiet Place Day One, Venom The Last Dance, and he's also the composer for Netflix's The Madness, which is absolutely incredible. So I'm super excited to get right into it. You grew up in the US, right?
Yeah, I grew up in upstate New York area, so near Niagara Falls, Buffalo, Rochester, that area. Then I went
And
to college. I went to university in Chicago at Northwestern University.
all right, and how did you get to LA then?
Uh, I was a trumpet major. I was doing kind of like serious orchestral trumpet playing. That was my life, and which is why I went to Northwestern because I had an amazing trumpet faculty. But I had been doing composition kind of on the side, and film music was something that I always was kind of drawn to in the composition world. And when I went into university, I kind of halfway through decided that I would much rather spend my time doing that. I started scoring student films, taking film classes, focusing more on composition. Um, and so when I graduated, the logical step when you're in America is to go to Los Angeles to try to kind of pursue that. And I had gotten into USC's graduate program, but I actually didn't end up going to it because I got a job out here with Conrad Pope, who's a pretty famous orchestrator. Um, and yeah, I just started working. Luckily, I was kind of in the workforce pretty early on in the business, so that's what got me here was music.
Yeah, that's definitely something that uh, I I feel towards you. Like music is such a complex thing, and I think it's also so beautiful how you can awake emotions with just the notes that you play. And your background, so it was playing the trumpet. Is it something that your parents came up with, or was it actually yourself that decided I want to play this instrument?
It was more me. There were two kind of big things for me for the trumpet, and that was my dad was in what we call drum corps when I was growing up, which is kind of like a really intense marching band. And it's very, very competitive. They play through the summers out here. They do major like field shows and all this kind of stuff. And he had marched his whole life. And once you get past 18, I think it's 18 or 21, you go into what's called a senior corps. And so he was still in a senior corps all through my childhood. So I was around music through him. He was a percussionist, like very kind of traditional rudimental drummer.
Mhm.
So I loved being around like these big walls of brass because that's basically what a drum corps is. It's just brass and percussion.
Yeah.
Um, and so I definitely was around music then. And then I think really what kind of shifted me was towards the trumpet too was Jurassic Park. I'll never forget the first time I heard the flying into the island theme, the big famous trumpet fanfare that plays as they're on the helicopter into the island. And it just kind of awakened something in me where I was like, "Oh, I want to play trumpet, and someday I want to do something involving film music, and then I did. My poor mother, I dragged her around Buffalo and Rochester looking for the sheet music to Jurassic Park because I just wanted to learn how to play that music so badly. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think like it was pretty early on. It was me. My parents were never kind of pushing me to do music. They were allowing me to do it. They were kind of encouraging me to continue doing it, but they weren't saying like, "Oh, you have to practice 30 minutes today." And I fell in love with it really early on. And I was an only child, and my parents had kind of split up early in my life. So I think I was alone a lot, and music kind of became a sibling for me too. It became my kind of best friend in a way. We had like a really old beat up piano that I used to plink and plonk on, and yeah, and then trumpet. I would play for hours. I would just listen to things and play along with them, and a lot of film music was a lot of how I learned how to play trumpet early on, was playing along with film music. And so it was definitely part of my DNA early on.
Yeah. So you actually learned the trumpet by playing by ear, like you what you heard, you tried to recreate it,
I
or
mean, it was part of the process. I definitely I mean, I played trumpet in in my grade school and all through school, and I was taking private lessons through. I grew up close to Eastman School of Music, so I went there a lot as a young kid for like their community education programs. That's also where I studied in Rochester. I studied composition, orchestration, conducting, all that stuff I did early on in my life because it was part of like what's called community education, which, it doesn't cost a whole heck of a lot to do it as a young kid because they want you to do it. They encourage young people to study music. So we kind of took advantage of that. The hardest part was getting there because it's like 45 minutes from where I grew up. So, it
oh
was just a lot of driving early on in my life.
yeah.
Um, but no, I was definitely formally taking lessons. I'm just saying a lot of, I think, what made me, like shaped my sound and shaped my compositional approach was that early days of me playing along with all that music and really getting to know it from the inside out.
Yeah. When do you know how old you were when you watched Jurassic Park and really got that feeling that this is something that you want to do?
Well, I think Dress Park was 1993, so I would have been 8 years old.
Whoa, okay.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I started playing the trumpet right away. It's just I remember the process of like clocking it in my head at 8 years old that was a really cool thing that I had just seen. And I just like I grew up like the I was born in 85, so I was starting to become conscious of content, in the early 90s to where you're actually processing it. You're 5 to 10 years old. And that was kind of like an amazing period for film music. You had Jerry Goldsmith, Horner, really early James Horner. You had Dave Newman, Tom Newman, certainly John Williams. I mean, Bruce Broughton. All these people were writing these incredible scores for children's films that were huge, big orchestral things. So, it's changed a bit nowadays. The approach of film music and the way we write film music has changed from that, for better or for worse. And I think I'm grateful that I grew up in the time I did because it's just it was magic. It was always magic. Every film was kind of there to take you on this magical journey, and there
Yeah.
was an escapist element to it where you kind of left your worries behind, and as a kid, you don't really have worries, so to speak, but if you can get a kid to focus on a movie, I think you've already won the battle because, our attention spans are short when we're young
Mm.
and I was just like obsessed. I could sit in front of that movie and I know that the music was part of that for me. So that is also my approach to how I write nowadays is I want to take people on a journey. I want to, craft a story with the music. I don't want to just kind of sit in the background and, you know, be ambience. I
Yeah.
think there's place for that. There's a place for that in certain genres and certain films and stories, but I will always kind of advocate for allowing music to become another character in the film, uh, to a certain extent.
On your website, you sometimes have listed as making additional music for movies, right?
Mm.
That is when you make music for that goes into the background, right? Like not is not so prominent, but pieces that get played in some scenes, but it doesn't entirely make the scene, if you can say so.
Well, no, additional music is more you're writing music under another composer, is usually how it
Ah,
is, but it's all still part of the score. So it doesn't
yeah.
really have to do with the prominence of the music, as it just has to do with the credit that you get in that film. But um,
Hmm.
for many years, I worked with Harry Gregson Williams, composer, and he just did the new Gladiator film that came out. Harry works on very, very large films, very complicated situations and huge systems and studio systems and it's like the process at which film music has to be written now is so quick compared to, even 30 years ago, that a lot of composers rely on additional composers to kind of come in and help them, get across. And the main composer is absolutely overseeing everything. They're making sure it's all working and they're writing and everybody's writing and whatnot. And you kind of like you work under them with their themes, their harmonic palettes, their sounds to kind of help get that score finished because sometimes I mean the time constraints are just ridiculous. How much music you have to write so quickly. It just becomes very difficult for one person to do that all on their own.
Mm.
So oftentimes additional composers or ghostwriters are brought in to kind of, just kind of take some of the burden off and get some more score out the door.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll have additional composers on my films, and
Would you?
sometimes it's like I just don't it's like a quality of life thing for me. It's like if I write 90% or 80% of the score and then 20% goes to another person, that might give me the opportunity to spend the evenings with my wife, rather than working all through the night. And to me, that's more important than, having my name 100% all over the cue sheet. I think
Yeah.
it's also just it's very hard to get started in this business, and I'm happy to kind of like help other people get started. And also their creative spark might lead to something in me. I mean, I work with a young guy, Caleb Blood, a lot, and he's like brilliant in his own way that he approaches things in a way maybe I wouldn't initially have seen that. And then inspires me and says like, oh, that's a really interesting way. I mean, I think the best part about music is it's so collaborative, and so much of what we do in film music is collaborative too. I mean, we're learning from a director, we're seeing a film through their eyes while also processing it in our own eyes. And I think you have to be open to learning from those different perspectives, because if you come into it closed-minded and say, well, this is how I experience this thing, you're missing the point of what we're doing. And that is like you have to process this information as if you're that director and say, okay, I see what you're trying to do. I'm getting where you're going. Now, how do I interpret that musically and put my feeling onto that, and I think like when you have some help here and there, I'll involve a lot of times soloists or different instrumentalists that'll come in and just like have them improvise over something that I have written just to kind of hear a different take on it, and it
Mm.
opens up maybe a little part of my brain that I didn't know was there, and then I start to hear like, oh wow, that could be really cool for that idea, and I just think collaboration is key in this business. So you have to kind of
Most
ride
definitely.
ride with it. There is, I mean, there's plenty of ego already in LA. So as much as you can keep yours out of it and just kind of embrace the chaos of it, I think it's great.
So, what you would say if you want to get started, it would be a smart thing to compose for someone else who's got a project and help him out with their composition first.
I think if you can get that opportunity, it's not easy to get. It's not like you can just knock on someone's door and be like, I want to write music for you. There's a vetting process, obviously, and they have to trust you because you are ultimately doing something in their name.
Mm.
Their
So you
name
don't
is
get credit. It's just
it depends. It's a gray area of this business, but what's considered ghostwriting would be you don't get any credit. Maybe you get some cue sheet credit, meaning you get some royalties.
Mm.
In the end of it, maybe you don't. That would be like true ghostwriting is no cue sheet and no on-screen credit. In which case, really, it's for the money you make up front and the experience of learning, and
Yeah.
being given that opportunity. And then additional music tends to be more like you get a credit, you get usually an additional music credit on screen, and then you get some cue sheet to where you're getting some royalties from what you've done. Um, which obviously is preferred in a sense because like you're getting your due on that. But um, I don't know. I encourage most people to kind of like do some additional music because you're going to have access to a film you wouldn't normally have access to, a project, usually because you're working for somebody who's more established. So they're going to be further along in their career at that point. Hopefully they're recording with an orchestra if it's that kind of project. So you're going to get to hear your music played with an orchestra. Um, and I think like, it gives you an opportunity to kind of step into a few more rungs up the ladder than where you were at that point. And you are going to learn. I mean, assuming you're working with a composer that is a bit more nurturing, they're going to help you kind of along the way and say like, ah, that's not really working. That's working great, and that's all experience, and that's really what you need.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would encourage people. I think the danger is that you do it for so long that you become very comfortable doing that. And some people do. Some people are totally content with being additional composers the rest of their life because they're making good money. It's job security if you're working with the same composer on a regular basis. Um, and it is less stress than being the
Mm.
main composer. You
Yeah.
know, the main composer has to deal with all the notes, all the kind of like creative feedback, whereas that's all being filtered through the composer when you're an additional composer.
Mm.
You're not sitting in on those meetings usually. So it is kind of a nice way to get your feet wet, and start to experience what it's like to be, high up on the kind of composing ring. Um,
Yeah. Do you have a composer that personally you're looking up to, like that you're inspired by, and that's making great music for other big projects?
sure. I mean, most composers I can find something that I admire about their work. I mean, I have a soft spot for Harry because I worked for him for so long and I think he's brilliant and has helped me so much in my career and same with Alan Silvestri. He really really helped me early on in my career and is brilliant, has written some of the greatest scores of my childhood he wrote but as far as like the younger guard that's starting to come up now, and I think Nicholas Britell is brilliant. I think he really is like amazing composer. I think Daniel Pemberton's really amazing.
Oh yeah.
I really like Chris Benstead, who does like all of Guy Ritchie's things lately. He's super inventive, very creative composer. Um, yeah, I mean there's so many talented people working now. I think there's it's hard to kind of like cheat your way through this business because there's so much talent. So if you're getting big opportunities, you generally are knowing you know what you're doing at this point. So but those I think would be the guys right now that I just like they seem to always surprise me, and do something
Yeah.
really interesting. John Powell's the same way. He's just like whatever he does tends to be very interesting.
Mm. All right, that's definitely a few names that I'm going to look up afterwards. But in contrast to where you're standing now, how was your beginning? Like when you started composing, you said you studied composing, right? And how did you get your first job where you actually made some money or and some experience? And then how did you come to a point where you made your own music for movies and not just additional music.
I studied composition in college, yes, and I studied it at the end of high school. So what I did is when I decided in college that I wanted to focus more on composition, I started asking all my friends that were like student filmmakers, because Northwestern, where I went to school, had a big, big film school. Uh, and so I started doing student films, and I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I was using like the sounds out of Finale, or I
Yeah.
was using the most basic of kind of things, or recording something really crudely, with a microphone that didn't deserve to be used to record something. Um, but but I think like most of my early experience to where I was the composer is in college. And then, you go to LA and everything kind of resets because there's a whole industry there and so I started as an kind of like as I tell a lot of people, when you come to LA, you got to kind of look for what can you immediately offer somebody that isn't writing music because everybody comes out here and wants to be a composer. And there's
Yeah.
just too many, and it's very hard to suddenly like the chances of you stumbling into a studio and saying, "Oh, I want to be an additional composer," and the composer being like, "Great, here you go," are low early on. I mean, almost zero early on,
Yeah.
unless you have some prior relationship. So I used orchestration as my kind of like foot in. I was really interested in it. Not that I was particularly good at it because I hadn't done a ton of it, but um, I I was passionate about it, and I had studied a lot of it privately outside of college. Even I was taking orchestration lessons.
Hmm.
Um, and when I was in my junior year of college, which was like the year before you graduate, um, I had an internship in LA and I was interning at Sony scoring stage on the stage and I met a lot of orchestrators and I kind of already had it in my mind that that was going to be my way of kind of like getting into the business. And I met Conrad Pope when I was there and we stayed in touch. Um, and when I finally decided to move to Los Angeles, I kind of wrote him and said, "Oh, I'm here now." And he said, "This is great. I'm about to start The Curious Case of Benjamin Button with Alexandre Desplat. And can you help out on it?" And it was proofreading. I was just making, double checking his orchestrations against what Alexander had written in his DAW, making sure everything was in order or whatnot. But it was very kismet timing, and I owe a ton to Conrad because it was like the world's greatest grad school. I mean, Conrad Pope has orchestrated for John Williams and James Horner and Jerry Goldsmith and basically every composer in Hollywood. Hans Zimmer. I mean, literally, he's beyond a genius when it comes to music. So I was getting to literally stare at these beautiful orchestrations of beautiful music every day. And a lot of my early life for the first, I would say, 3 to 4 years was just orchestration. And I was actually starting to get a little worried that I was never going to be a composer because it was just going to become an orchestrator, which I loved doing, but there was still, I still wanted to focus on writing. And in 2011 is when I went to the Sundance Composers Lab, and that's kind of when everything changed for me. That's when I met Harry, and that's where I met Alan Silvestri. And those two composers kind of took me under their wing after that. And Harry, I started writing for immediately afterwards. And I worked for him for a good solid 6 years straight and will still hop over to a project now and then for him. Um, and Alan was the reason I got my first solo feature. He was the one that recommended me to the producers. But I was in LA for about 10 years until I got my first like solo feature with a budget where you would recognize the cast. You know, I mean, I had done like little small independent things or whatever, friends things, but that was the first time I went through like a demo process, and it was a cast of Oscar-winning actors and actresses, and I got the film, and it took like a good 10 years. I had done additional music and ghostwriting for many, many composers up to that point. Probably for like a good five years. So it took about 4.5 to 5 years for me to start doing additional music to where I was writing for other composers, and then another 5 years to finally get my own thing going out of that. Um,
Wow.
and then things start to kind of like, you meet the producers and then they do another movie, so you do their movie, or the director does another film and you do their film, or somebody hears the score and likes what you did, and it kind of, I mean, maybe it's never as fast as you want it to go, but things will move at a certain pace. And, I've been lucky with the projects I have been doing for writing, because I've gotten to do a lot of different genres. Even like this new show that came out, The Madness, was very different than something like Wish Dragon, which was like a big orchestral thing, versus like Medieval, which was this kind of period drama. Um, and I've done like dark kind of synth things, but I mean, orchestra is my upbringing, so it's the most comfortable I am with writing is orchestral. But that's the non-Reader's Digest version of how I got to where I am. It was a little long.
That's a incredible journey to also see like, okay, it's not going to happen overnight, and it takes time to really improve, get better at music, build uh, a repertoire, build credit that you know you can do this and can actually show it to other people, and then from meeting one person you can get to the next person that maybe likes your music and then get featured in another work. So this whole process, I mean, my goal is very ambitious to orchestrate for a movie in 3 years, but I know it's going to take time, and I may have this goal of doing it in 3 years, but I am aware that it may take longer, and it is a long game. You're not in it for just 1 year and then you're gonna stop, or reach all the success in the world. It's not going to happen. So it is really a long game, and I think that's what your story of getting into the music really um, showed me again, that it takes time to become better and to make improvements and really get into the big productions. Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to realize that music is like a lifelong journey, and you have to kind of t take steps back along the process and just kind of look at where you are. I mean, I remember last year when we were doing the final mix for The Madness, for Netflix, and we were sitting on this big, beautiful stage in Hollywood, and they were doing a playback, and it was the last episode, so a lot of the executives from Netflix were there, as like a celebration that it was the end of the season, and
mm,
you have like a little those little moments where I looked around and I was like, this is incredible. I got to write music for this show, and there's over 3 hours of my music in this show, and
wow,
everybody's loving, this process, and everyone's happy, and you have these moments. I did arrangements for Aerosmith at one point, and I was in the studio with Steven Tyler, and I was just like, this is crazy that I'm here. And or I'm standing in front of a 100-piece orchestra in New Zealand conducting Wish Dragon. It's just like you have these little moments where you're like, things are good. Like, you're working really hard and things are happening, and then you go through periods where like you work really hard and nothing happens, but that's just part of what we do, and I mean, this industry is very kind of volatile. It goes up, it goes down. We've had a weird few years now between COVID and the strikes and all that kind of stuff, to where it feels like a lot of people have been kind of beaten down a little, and that's understandable. And it's a lot of what you do in especially in the film industry is like perseverance, and eventually,
mm,
like, the only thing you can really control is when you're finally given an opportunity to do your best work, to be the best collaborator you can be, and, put forth your best effort. And you'll learn more from that than trying to, like, convince everybody that you're a genius. I mean, it's just like not worth that fight. I mean,
Yeah.
I openly admit to showrunners and directors and producers, like I don't have all those answers early on. The first time we look at a cut together, I might be terrified in a way because it's like, oh my gosh, how do we even start this? Like, where do we begin with this? And how do we look at this? And and I think like there's power in that vulnerability of saying like you're open to hearing what other people are experiencing in it. And um, but I think orchestration is, it's a whole nother ball game. Orchestration, you're more of like a support collaborator for a composer, and I think, it is a learning process. I mean, I feel like every time I do a score, even if it's like I'm just working on something now for a friend composer who's doing a session on Monday in Warner Brothers, and even if the music isn't like insanely John Williams-esque complicated counterpoints everywhere and all this kind of big, huge orchestras, even if it's just strings, you look
Mm.
at it and you go, okay, how can I voice these strings as beautifully as I possibly can? Or how can I make them sing? How can I make it so that the first time we play this, it sounds great? We don't have to do any adjustments. And that takes a long time to get to there. And I still, to this day, don't take for granted that every time I look at a new orchestration, it's a new piece of music, and I will never kind of fall back on certain things. And I get to do that for a lot of really amazing composers. I mean, every time I work on a James Newton Howard score, I pinch myself because I think he's an absolute genius, or something for Ludwig. I mean, Ludwig Göransson's really incredible composer, very creative, unique, and kind of like stretches my brain from an orchestration standpoint. And I think like I think ultimately like what will lead to longevity and success in this business is constantly being curious about it. Not approaching it from like a super, I mean, it's good to have goals and it's a very important part of what we are as human beings, but I think like think of this as like you're always learning and you're always curious. And those goals will naturally happen if you do that because you're going to constantly be kind of like ingratiating yourself to people because people want to be around others that are, naturally curious and learn because they're going to be growing in the process. So, yeah.
Yeah. That was great. Um, you talked a lot about composing and orchestration, and from getting to not only orchestrating but composing yourself. What exactly is the difference between the two things?
Well, I mean, certainly there's a part of writing composing that is orchestration, especially nowadays, because back in the 20s through the 70s, I would say, maybe into the 80s, most composers would write on, like a sketch. They would write a sketch thing and like a 5-line, 6-line sketch. And then that sketch would go to a orchestrator. So in that sense, like there's like true orchestration. You're taking 6 lines of a sketch and blowing it out for a huge orchestra. Um, but orchestration is the process of taking the raw material from a composer and assigning all of the parts to the orchestra. That's basically what it is. So taking like a digital file from a DAW and turning it into sheet music, like, that a musician can read from.
Yeah,
Um, and nowadays, because DAWs are so advanced and we have all these great samples to work with and VSTs and all that kind of stuff, is a lot of that orchestration is somewhat done, because you're programming in a violin line, you're programming in your trumpets, your brass, whatever you're doing.
yeah,
um However, the orchestrator is kind of there to smooth out the edges for you. And I think the best orchestrators in town interpret those pieces of music. They don't just like literally copy them. Um, and I mean, of course, if the composer wants that, some composers are perfectly happy with you doing exactly what they mocked up. But So, like what an orchestrator gets from a composer is a MIDI file. It's like the MIDI file from their sequence and then a mix. And then from that data, you start making the score. You start assigning the notes, you start voicing the strings, you start kind of putting the pieces together to be played.
Hmm.
Um, that's what I mean. Like when you're writing, you're orchestrating a little bit, obviously, because you're writing different lines, you're putting in different parts, but the actual kind of final step to that process is an orchestrator formalizing those things, engraving them, putting in all the dynamics, writing in all the time changes, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. All right. And right now, yeah, we know DAWs are very incredible nowadays. You can make
Mhm.
an orchestra in your PC. How much is this actually being used when you compose and orchestrate? And uh, for some projects that you do, is it sometimes the case that you only do something in a DAW and not with an actual orchestra or not people actually playing the things on
Yeah,
real?
for sure. If your budget doesn't have money for an orchestra, you just leave it in the box, as we say. Um, you can just, do a nice job on your mock-ups and make them sound as good as you can, and then those are end up as the final mixes of things. I would say nowadays, 99% of composers are using DAWs, for their everyday life. I would think John Williams is maybe the 1% that doesn't, because he is who he is. And, he basically only works with Spielberg at this point, and Spielberg just doesn't need to hear demos, He's happy with whatever genius John Williams comes up with. But for every other mortal on in our business, it's the DAW is where we live.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are some composers I've worked with that still do piano sketches, but they tend to be the older guard, that grew up doing it. I worked with Alan Menken a few times, and he does that. Mark Shaman is another one that does that. But that, they've been around for a while, and that was their start. Their career was that world.
Hmm.
But to answer the other parts of your question, yeah, I mean, I think that was
If
your
the
question,
budget's
right?
not, yeah, if the
Yeah, if the
budget doesn't,
budget's not high enough, we just leave it in the box.
yeah.
And then sometimes you only have budget to do like the strings, so you'll have like your brass will stay samples, but you'll replace your strings, or sometimes you do like a small string section or a small brass section and combine them with your samples to give it a little more oomph. Even literally one live player will transform the way your demo sounds. I mean, I tell people all the time, if you can bring in one violin player on top of if you write them a solo and they play the solo over the top of your samples, people will think it's all real because they're going to be
Mhm.
hearing that violin so much. Um, but generally, obviously, if it's a project where you're not recording an orchestra, you don't need orchestrators. An
Yeah.
orchestrator would only be needed if you're needing to create scores.